Right, so I'm James Devon, this is Simeon, and we've got the task of taking you through the 7 key points today. The first key point is about social is more than marcoms and is challenging organisations. In some ways this is really quite obvious, but it's about the process we went through and understanding the journeys we've taken and therefore what that means. So the first thing you come across when you start thinking about, well, how does social media work? How do we measure it properly? Is it's plural in so many different ways. It's really hard to untangle this mesh of all the things that it can be. You take the basic paid and owned model of media buying there, and of course social could be all of those, depending on what you're trying to do with it, depending on the day of the week, depending on your objective. It can of course work on all of those different dimensions. And then you get to the, well, what's it trying to do? Is it marketing department, customer insight, customer research? Whose is it? No one knows. And you have to end up with different client or parts of the client organisation all fighting over the same thing, and it just gets a little bit confused. Who's meant to be doing what's going on? So, and then you get this one. It doesn't fit into nice boxes anymore. Our campaigns used to be from the start of the month to the end, a nice defined period by which you were spending some money on some media. And then we've got this concept of always on, where people are just, guess what, doing whatever they want to do, going onto the internet, playing with Facebook whenever they want to do it. And that brings in all new dimensions. And social can work anywhere along that spectrum, all the way from this always-on thing to a more pure campaign. And where does it sit along that thing? So you bung all that lot together, and you end up, like this poor girl on the right, you end up splashed with the fire hose of data and information, of too much knowledge going on, too many different things. And so you start to ask yourself some really pertinent questions. A lot of the cases that didn't quite get through were where there had been no real forethought as to what am I trying to measure? How am I going to get that data so that in a few months' time I can know whether if this is good or bad? Many didn't even have objectives. So you didn't even know whether this was going to be good or not. A sensible business structure. The example I've got on the next page is from TfL, who fundamentally changed the way their business was structured in order to deliver against their social objectives. Pleased to have Chris with us in the audience, who can maybe talk about more later. But yeah, how do you manage this? How do you organise the client business? How do you organise the data feeds? How do you get all this in so that it starts to make sense? And then there's this dichotomy. You've got lots of numbers. Yay! It's a good thing having lots of numbers, but many ways you have too many numbers. You don't know which ones are the important ones. And so, back to the theme of the evening, you end up counting, not measuring. And of course, you can start to use some of these numbers on a live basis. You can tweak your campaigns and you can optimize on the fly and do all sorts of exciting things. But at the same time, are you planning for the longer term? It's a point we'll pick up a bit later. And it always comes back down to balancing against the objectives. So just as an example here, this is social at the heart of digital transformation. This is the main thrust of the TfL example that you can find on the websites of the various organisations. Because in order to provide real-time updates in customer service across the business, the different parts of the organisation had to speak to each other. The data had to flow freely between them. The live information couldn't just stop in one siloed and then not be passed on, because it would have been a mess. I think it's probably the safest expression to use right now. Retraining of the customer service teams to envelop new skills. So you didn't have to have, oh, no, sorry, I'm not social, I just do the phones. You've got all this bung together where one person who's an expert can answer questions in many different formats and structure, kind of obvious, structure the shift patterns to cover 24/7. So you can answer questions when customers need to answer them, need to ask them, rather. So that's the first one. That's about basically thinking beyond marcoms and thinking about client organisational structure.
Thank you, James. Well, so the second thing we found out is that social is really changing the way that we do measurement. And probably the clearest way to show that is to start with an example. So this is the Ice Bucket Challenge, which I'm sure, I don't know, some of you may have actually taken part in. But just as a reminder, basically the Ice Bucket Challenge was done in behalf of the ALS disease, which is actually motor neuron disease, I think most of us know here. And the idea of the challenge was that you tip a bucket of water over your head, you challenge someone else to do the same, and they have to do the same within 24 hours. And it was a little bit uncertain about who actually started this. A lot of golfers claiming they started it. But it started roughly in the US in July this year. And as you can see from this graph, it spread very, very quickly, with a lot of celebrities getting in on the act, a lot of presidents and ex-presidents, and it spread very, very clearly. Rapidly across the world, yeah. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I'll turn this off.
And I think that what it shows, apart from being an amazing piece of social activity in its own right, a sort of outlier, I think we would definitely say, is it shows a couple of things about measurement. And the first is that the metrics show not only what happens, but importantly they offer the potential of offering how communication works, where it works, and when it works. So a real opportunity for us to understand how things are working in a different way than other metrics that we've had in the past. And secondly, as Paddy mentioned, these metrics are very visible and they're very cheap to get. So quite interestingly, in the case of the Ice Bucket Challenge, two very canny researchers from Hong Kong University took the data and measured it and said, well, just how viral was the Ice Bucket Challenge? And it turns out that it's slightly more viral than the other event of the summer, which is Ebola, but actually nothing like as viral as the current outbreak of measles, which is 7 times more viral than either the Ice Bucket Challenge or Ebola. So get your children vaccinated, I think is the message of that. So three ways in which social is changing measurement. The first is these metrics, which I think hold out this potential of offering not just what happened, but how it happened. So metrics in the way of what people are thinking in terms of text and sentiment. Metrics in the way of granularity and timeliness can then offer how culture is evolving and how we can predict that and link into that. Metrics which allow us to understand the social graph, which I think is really interesting because we've never been able to see word of mouth spread in the way that it probably has been spreading. So a whole new set of metrics, along with metrics, a whole confusion about how to use them, and there's a lot of practical advice in the guide about how to sort through metrics. The second thing is that, like a lot of digital media, social is real time. But unlike a lot of digital media, it can really offer some insight on every part of the sort of planning process, all the way from insight to creative to execution and targeting. And as such, it is really the cornerstone of fueling adaptive marketing in terms of social media. So it's almost first amongst digital media. But most importantly, I think social is changing how we measure because it is changing the culture. And I think we're moving from a culture of collecting data to a culture of interpreting data. So it used to be the case that inside companies and organizations, the marketing research person was the person who basically made sure there was only one measure of brand equity, one measure of market share, and those days are gone. Those days are gone now, partly through social, because there's lots of ways of measuring things, and they're seeping into the organization in lots of ways. And so the skill is really about how to interpret conflicting data and not just about collecting data. And that's one of the reasons why social has been at the heart of loop rooms and war rooms and all of that collective decision making through data. So it's a really important change, I think, that social is ushering in. So the third key finding is about social doesn't work in a silo. Now, lots of things don't work in isolation, but social in particular. And it's not just because mass media affects the context in which earned develops, but actually it's also because mass media or TV or TV advertising actually leads you to click or interact in the first place, to be exposed to social media. So there's a really deep synergy. And I think one of the things that we found through all of this is probably paid media, paid social is absolutely critical to the success of social all the way through this. What that means for measurement is you have to be able to not just isolate the effect of social, you have to be able to understand how it works synergistically. So a couple of examples from the US in terms of just how important this is. So the first is from an organization called Convertro. Convertro basically use attribution modeling. So if you like, that's sort of econometric modeling on steroids with using very granular level data. And one of the things they found is that paid social was converting 25% better than earned social. And that's almost certainly because it's better targeted. The second piece of research is that from Nielsen, and what it showed is that actually if you take a siloed measurement approach to usually your market mix modeling for things like social or Facebook, you're likely to underestimate the true effect by up to 50%. So measuring things together is actually critical to measuring it at all in often cases. So our strong advice is to take a modeling approach to measuring synergy. And that I would say goes, you take a modeling approach even if you're doing test and learn. So I think one of the things we're seeing a lot now is that the platforms are giving us the opportunity to build experiments and test cells. What our advice is, even when they do that, you should still do the modeling because you need to understand how things work together, and whereas test and learn and A/B tests only tend to isolate. So it's incredibly important to do the two things together. So two quick examples, practical examples from the case studies about how to measure social. This one is from Lysol, Rinkita's Lysol in the USA. Modeling work was done by OHAL. And what it showed was a very, very simple, naive market mix modeling found there was no impact of Facebook on sales at all. But actually, if you dug into it deeper and said, well, actually, the role of Facebook is quite different at different stages of the journey. Earned actually affects awareness. Paid social affects consideration. And then you model the whole of the causal chain. Actually, what it showed was instead of the effect being 0, the effect was about 0.5% of sales actually when the campaign was running. So quite significant and meaningfully significant. The second way of measuring synergies is to measure almost directly, and this is a slightly more sophisticated approach which uses Kantar World Panel consumer sales data. And what it does is it matches media to individual sales and purchases. So the example we've got here is from Cremeg. So what they've done is they've matched the media data and the social data to individual purchases, and then they've modeled that. So they've taken into account all the other things that affect sales, such as pricing, pre-existing loyalty, all of those other factors. And interesting, what they can see here is that there is a synergy indeed between Facebook and TV, and it's greater than just the amount of people that saw both. So as you can see, it's 66% greater synergy than just the pure reach duplication. And again, you can measure that because you're doing this in measuring it in a very granular way. So the fourth key thing that's key finding is it's very easy to overestimate earned media and influencers. So, and I think we sort of know that measuring causality is very, very difficult with earned media. And really there are three reasons why that is. The first is reverse causality, which you tend to find with aggregate sales. You do a simple correlation and you find, oh look, there's a relationship between social and between sales. You think there's a simple correlation and therefore it's causal. Actually, it turns out really that everybody's tweeting about a promotion when it's the promotion that caused the sales, and so there's a seeming correlation. So what happens is you get this reverse correlation in the data. That's incredibly prevalent in what we do. The second thing is homophily, and obviously it takes new media to bring back Latin. And homophily is really an issue when you're trying to understand the social graph and you're trying to understand how messages spread. So like in the ice bucket challenge. And the real phenomenon is saying, actually, it's not so much that I do this because you do this, and I've seen you do that, and so I'm copying you through the network. What it really is that people in networks are often very similar people, so they respond to external events in the same way, so it just looks like they're responding in the same way. So, an example might be, I follow Stephen Fry. Stephen Fry then tweets Je suis Charlie. I tweet Je suis Charlie, but I don't tweet it because he did it. We tweet it because of the external event. So it's a very, very prevalent issue, and you'll see there's a lot of discussion in the guide about understanding homophily. And the third area why causation is quite difficult, and it's easy to overstate this, is around influencers. And this is a huge topic which Ray has aptly described and summarised in the guide. And if the guide is worth reading anything, it's worth reading his section on influencers. And I think that what we know is that influencers seem quite a plausible idea, and you can certainly imagine circumstances in which there are influencers. But actually, when you look at the research, what it suggests is, well, maybe it's not so big. It's not as big a phenomenon as you might think. It's not as big because, frankly, there just aren't very many influencers. It's not as big because, actually, almost by definition, influencers are quite difficult to influence, and so they've already made up their mind. And thirdly, it's usually easy to spot influences in hindsight rather than prospectively. So all in all, you can begin to see influences everywhere, but in reality, they're often not there. And for us, often in mass media, that does tend to mean that mass media is probably a little bit more important than we thought, even in the world of social. So you might think that those kind of issues were all quite, one for the nerds worrying about causality. But actually, it turns out this is incredibly important. So the lead kind of researcher in this space is a guy called Sinan Aral, and a US academic. And one of the things that he's pointed out is that actually getting this wrong actually often overestimates the impact of social by 500%. So this isn't a one for the nerds. This is actually incredibly important. And here's a good example of it being important. So we're often quite interested in the relationship between Twitter and TV. And hey, presto, here's some research that actually we've done with Kantar Media and with Twitter from TV programs in the UK. And what it shows is how many programs, if you do a correlation, is there a relationship between minutes by minute tweeting and viewing. And raw correlation, well over half, which is what you expect. But the real question is, how much of that is actually causal? How much of that is to do with people seeing the tweet and then going to the program? In order to do that, you have to dig really deep into the detail. You have to look at minute by minute viewing to see whether there was a surge in tweets before there was a surge in viewing, program by program, in a very granular way, taking into account day parts and all the other stuff. And what it shows is actually only about 11% of programs actually have a causal link, which is actually still quite a lot, I think. And the incremental audience that Twitter adds in this case is around 1 to 2%. So in some programs and for some genres, it's actually very significant. But notice that the actual correlation, the causation, is again about 5 times less than the raw causation, the raw correlation. So it kind of reserves that point, which is easy to see a correlation with earned media, even when there's nothing causal going on. So what do you do about it? The first one is to be pragmatic, because frankly there isn't a simple answer. What constitutes probably best practice, I would say, is test and control, because if you really want to figure out whether something is causal, actually experiments is probably the best way. And I think a lot of the platforms, Facebook for example, are making it very easy to do that, and Twitter with their relationship with Datalogics and various other providers. But I think a key message from here is that is not sufficient. Actually, if you really want to understand how social is working, you need to do the modelling on top of the experiments to tease apart how things work if you want to replicate stuff. Because again, it's not just about isolating the effect of social, it's about understanding how to replicate its effects later. And then the fourth one is to be suspicious, because if it looks too high, it almost certainly is too high. And the fifth thing that we found out, and in terms of the key findings, is that actually, ultimately, we think a lot of the value of social is increasingly in the data. And it's something we touch on in the guide. It's something which is very much an evolving space. And I think we'd sing out a couple of areas. I mean, the first is in the area of area of sentiment. We all kind of feel as though there's something in there, and I think we've all spent quite a lot of time trying to find the signal in the noise. But the truth is there's a lot of noise in sentiment analysis, and it isn't really going to go away, because the data could be often quite poor, machines are actually quite fallible, and humans are very ambiguous. So inferring sentiment from data is always going to be quite difficult. What's quite interesting then is how do you use that imperfect signal in models that can be predictive and therefore link together metrics. As I said earlier on, I think one of the things that we're in a sort of culture of interpretation, which is actually about how you understand how things link together. So for example, TNS Research have been doing some work to understand how social and search can predict brand equity, and you can build models that actually predict brand equity 2 months out from when you actually know it, which is partly to do with the fact that it takes some time to feed back consumer research, and gives some real early warning signals for how to work. So using social in predictive modelling, I think, is a key thing that is developing right now. And the second area is in the area of granular data. I sort of hesitate to use the phrase big data because I think it's been completely already a tired phrase. But there's undoubtedly something in the idea of bringing together granular first-party data and addressable media data to be able to target and tailor experiences. And social, with its richnesses and preferences, and also the fact that there is a very good value exchange with the consumer about why they stay logged on with you, and so you can get more information from them in a way which is actually a reasonable value exchange for them, means that this level of data that you're getting with social is incredibly powerful for the organisation. An example is the case study that Stephen mentioned, which is just about to come on stream, we hope, is from IBM. And what they've done is they've very intelligently used social data to be able to target people who are at the very early stages of the buying cycle in B2B computing, and then target appropriate content to them in a way which is actually almost like mass marketing. So they've done it in a reasonably automated way. And the ROI, as it kind of comes down the funnel for the sales guys, is actually phenomenal. So we're just clearing those numbers, which you'll be able to see in the case study. I think the caveat is the one that Paddy mentioned early on, is that the future of data and social within it is probably very powerful, but actually the risk is intervening in those private conversations, and we've got to square that before we get too carried away about what that commercial value is. James.
Number 6, social can learn from traditional planning. Now, it's hard not to sound a bit patronising with this one, but really this is about social strategy disconnected from broader marketing strategy is just bonkers. And we've got to find a way of making sure it all ties together. Without due consideration, you end up in this sort of situation. So this is a quote from Jeff Goldblum's character in Jurassic Park. But your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should. And this is a classic social media behaviour. We should do that. Why? Oh, because I thought I wanted to. And it's isolating that because we wanted to type thinking from making sure that we're pinning social activity to broader marketing and business objectives. So we've got Stephen King's planning cycle in the guide, the real kind of basic top-line thinking about where do we need to be, where are we now, where do we need to get to, and thinking much more broadly about how this is part of a bigger strategy. How does it complement the other channels and other activities that you've got going on? How does it fit beyond those that campaign thinking to, website content, all of those different things? Bake it in from the start is a message that comes in loud and clear, thinking ahead about what you need to do, what you need to achieve, and thinking about how you're going to measure that further down the line. It's about the data preparation, the points we've already made. Contributing to overall marketing and brand objectives, I've made that point already, but then having a clear role and purpose for social. We want social to do this. We think it will work like this, and we'll know whether it did or not using this data, and that number, and that number. And then even if you get it wrong, you can at least say, well, it didn't work like that, but it did work like that. And so next time I shall use it. So it's all just that really quite classic thinking of what is the role for this bit of activity and how is that going to fit in. But then you've got that balance of you have got that real-time thing. If you have got some extra numbers that you can usefully use to inform your activity, then of course use it and optimize ongoing in that sort of live, real-time type sentiment. But fundamentally, make sure it's considered as part of everything that you're doing. In the guide, this is deliberately too small to read, so you have to buy the guide. This is the 5-point plan. This is a practical piece of advice for thinking through what should you be thinking about when you're measuring social. So this is about organising the data. This is why social. What role is it trying to play? How does it fit with the other things? How am I going to evaluate it? What type of numbers, what type of metrics do I need to gather, and where can I get them from? So this is a really important bit of practical information. It's not meant to, you don't have to linearly follow it 1 through 5. And in fact, depending on where you're at as an organisation, you may do it in not quite that same order. That's not really the point. The point is these are interesting things to think about in order that you will be able to measure your social media a bit further down the line. So that's a really useful, practical piece of information. And here's the other one, the short and the long, even short-term results into long-term context. And this is really reiterating some of the points we've made earlier, but we know that the big stuff, the money, is in the long term. That's where the big effects happen, the price sensitivity and all those other things. And to have a long-term effect is not the same as having lots of short-term effects. They are different things, they work in a different way. I'm wincing at Les and hoping it doesn't come to my eye. That's right. Don't shout me down. But also a nod here to the Walk report that Peter Field has written. They focus more on what types of campaigns seem to be working rather than how you measure. But there's a key observation in there that this seems to have a real potential for that long-term stuff, but it's being used for short-term activation. And so we don't know whether it can really have a big effect because it's been used so tactically and so short-term. So the point really here is short-term effects are still good, but bear in mind that we should also be building towards that longer goal. We should be thinking about the business objectives, the marketing objectives. What are we really trying to do with this brand? And therefore, how is social supporting me on that pathway? Yes, do all the optimization and on-the-fly stuff that the short-term numbers and metrics allow you to do, but keep your eye on the goal and have a state that's, if I could say anything, it would be about that, and make sure you have a clear role for that social and what it's trying to achieve regardless. So hopefully that's whet your appetite. Those are the 7 kind of key learnings, key things which we found out. There's a whole range there, and I think a lot of that boils down to there are lots of exciting ways in which you can use these data. Some of the things that Simeon's been talking about are new. They're new ways of doing things, and as such they're exciting. But they're about the granularity of data and thinking through how all this builds into a bigger picture story. And that's the key takeout for me, is to measure, not count. You need to think about social as part of the broader marketing ecosystem. Thank you very much.